Imagine for a moment that you find a small wooden box carved with strange symbols. When you open it, you discover a mummified, wrinkled, dark brown monkey's paw. A shiver runs down your spine as a question invades your mind. What dark desires could you fulfill with this mysterious object? The White family lived in a modest house in London. One night, they received a visit from Sergeant Morris, an old friend who had been to India. Sergeant Morris told them stories of his trip and showed them a stuffed monkey's paw, which he claimed had the power to grant 3 wishes to 3 different people. Sergeant Morris told them that he had already used his, and that they had brought him nothing but misfortune. He warned them that the monkey's paw was an evil thing that granted wishes. He advised them not to use it and to throw it into the fire. But Mr. White, moved by curiosity, snatched it from them and put it away. It was a cold and rainy night in London. The White family gathered around the fireplace in a humble house on Laburnum Street. Mr. White, a gray-haired old man with a gray mustache, was playing chess with his son Herbert, a jolly, joking young man who worked in a factory. Mrs. White, a middle-aged woman who was good-natured and worried-looking, was watching the game while knitting a scarf. "Ha! I've beaten you again, father!" exclaimed Herbert, moving his queen to checkmate. "It's not fair. You always beat me," complained Mr. White. "Perhaps you should make a wish on the monkey's paw," suggested Herbert with a mischievous grin, and went on to say, "And have you made any wishes?" approaching the monkey's paw curiously. "No, I haven't had the courage. Besides, I can't think of anything to wish for. I'm happy with what I have," answered Mr. White. "Happy with this cold old house and with this hard, low-paying job," replied Herbert. "Well, it's not so bad. We have a home, we have health, and we have love. What more could you ask for?" argued Mr. White. "Well, I would ask for a lot of things. For instance, £200 to pay the mortgage on the house," said Herbert, picking up the monkey's paw and rubbing it. "Herbert, don't do that. You don't know what may happen," exclaimed Mr. White. "Don't be superstitious, father. It's only a joke. I don't think this thing has any power," said Herbert, dropping the monkey's paw. "You'd better leave it alone, son." "Don't play with fire," advised Mr. White. "It's all right," said Herbert, letting go of the monkey's paw. "Don't worry, father. I won't touch it again," Herbert promised. The White family continued talking for a while longer, until it got late and they decided to go to bed. Mr. White turned off the fireplace, took the monkey's paw, and put it in a drawer. Then he went upstairs with his wife and son, not suspecting something terrible would happen. The next morning, the White family awoke to a loud knock on the door. Mr. White went downstairs to open it and was met by a man dressed in black, wearing a top hat and carrying a briefcase. "Good morning, Mr. White. May I come in?" said the man. Yes, of course. Come in, answered Mr. White, confused. The man entered the house and sat down on the sofa. Mr. White followed him and sat down opposite him. Mrs. White and Herbert came downstairs and joined them. "Good morning, Mrs. White." "Good morning," Herbert greeted the man and continued. "Sorry to disturb you so early, but I have some bad news to tell you. You see, I am the representative of the company where your son works. I regret to inform you that there has been an accident at the factory," the man explained. "An accident? What kind of accident? Is Herbert all right?" Mrs. White asked in anguish. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. White, but your son is dead," said the man. "Herbert, my son!" exclaimed Mr. White, hugging his wife. It was a horrible tragedy. Their son was working on one of the machines when his clothes got caught and dragged him into the blades. There was nothing they could do to save him. The company is responsible for the incident and is offering them financial compensation for their loss, continued the man, opening his briefcase. "What compensation?" asked Mr. White angrily. £200, said the man, taking out an envelope and handing it to Mr. White. £200? Is that all my son's life worth? Protested Mr. White indignantly. That's what the contract states, Mr. White. That's all we can do, apologized the man. Damn it, "Damn, the monkey's paw!" exclaimed Mr. White, remembering the wish Herbert had made the night before. "The monkey's paw? What are you talking about, Mr. White?" asked the man, confused. Nothing. Forget it," said Mr. White, putting the envelope in his pocket. "Well, that's all said and done. I offer my condolences and I'll be on my way. If you need anything, don't hesitate to contact me," said the man, getting up and leaving the house. Mr. White and Mrs. White were left alone, hugging and crying for their dead son. They did not notice that the monkey's paw, which was in the drawer, moved slightly as if it had a life of its own. Several days passed, and the White family could not get over the pain of losing Herbert. Mr. White locked himself in his room, not wanting to go out or talk to anyone. Mrs. White spent the hours staring out the window, waiting to see her son come home. The house was filled with silence and sadness. One night, Mrs. White had an idea. She got out of bed and went to the drawer where the monkey's paw was. She picked it up and carried it to her husband's room. Wake up, she said, shaking him. "What's wrong?" asked Mr. White drowsily. "I have the solution," said Mrs. White. "The solution? What are you talking about?" asked Mr. White, confused. "The monkey's paw," said Mrs. White, showing him the object. "What does the monkey's paw have to do with it?" asked Mr. White, frightened. "It has to do with everything. The monkey's paw can grant 3 wishes, remember? Herbert asked for £200 and he got it, but at the cost of his life. We have 1 wish left, a wish we can use to bring him back," Mrs. White explained eagerly. "Bring him back? Don't you see what the monkey's paw has done? Don't you see it's a curse?" said Mr. White with horror. "No, it's not a curse. It's a chance to get our son back. We just have to ask, insisted Mrs. White. "No, don't do it. You don't know what can happen. You don't know how he can come back. Think about what Sergeant Morris said. Think about the consequences," warned Mr. White. "I don't care about the consequences. I only care about Herbert. I just want to see him. I just want to hold him. And I just want to tell him I love him," said Mrs. White. "Please let him rest in peace. Don't bring him into this world of suffering. Don't do it for him. Don't do it for us," pleaded Mr. White, with tears in his eyes. "No, I can't. I can't live without him. I can't live without him. I can't bear this emptiness." "I will do it," said Mrs. White, and before Mr. White could stop her, Mrs. White rubbed the monkey's paw and said aloud, "I wish that Herbert would come back to life." After making the second wish, the house fell silent. Herbert's parents looked at each other expectantly, waiting for some sign that their son had returned. But nothing happened. The monkey's paw fell to the ground, inert. An hour passed, and another, and another. The night grew darker and colder. The house grew quieter and gloomier. Suddenly, a noise was heard. It was a distant and faint noise, but it broke the silence. A noise that sounded like a knock on the door. "What is that?" asked the father, startled. "I don't know," said the mother, frightened. The noise was repeated, a louder and closer blow, a blow that sounded like a fist that wanted to enter. "Who is it?" asked the father, shouting. The noise was repeated, a harder and clearer blow, a blow that sounded like a kick that wanted to break the door. Open up! A voice was heard, a voice hoarse and low but familiar, a voice that sounded like Herbert's. "Herbert!" exclaimed the mother. "It's him!" said the mother, excited. "It can't be!" said the father, terrified. The mother ran to the door while the father followed her. The noise and the voice kept banging and knocking. The door wobbled and creaked. The house shook and vibrated. Fear and anguish gripped them. The mother reached the door and tried to open it, but it was locked. She looked for the key but could not find it. It was in the father's pocket. "Give me the key," the mother asked him. "No, he is not your son," the father refused. The mother and father fought over the key while the noise and the voice kept banging and knocking. The mother managed to snatch the key from the father and go to the door. The father followed and tried to stop her. The mother turned the key and opened the door. The father peeked in and saw what was on the other side. It was Herbert. But it was not Herbert they remembered. It was a disfigured and mutilated Herbert, his clothes in tatters and his blood dried. It was Herbert who had been buried for a week and had been brought back to life by the monkey's paw. The father felt a shiver of terror and revulsion. The three stood transfixed, staring at each other, not knowing what to do. Then the father reacted. He remembered that he still had the monkey's paw in his hand. He remembered that he still had one wish left. He remembered what Sergeant Morris had said, that the monkey's paw always fulfilled wishes terribly. He remembered what had happened with the first wish, and what had happened with the second. He remembered that he didn't want to see Herbert like this, that he didn't want him to suffer anymore, that he didn't want his wife to suffer anymore. He remembered that he had to end it all, that he had to undo what he had done, that he had to make the third wish. Before the mother could hug Herbert and before Herbert could enter the house, the father rubbed the monkey's paw and said in a low voice, "I wish Herbert to be dead again." The monkey's paw has served its purpose, but at a high price. Would you dare touch the monkey's paw if you could find it? This video has been made for Mythology. For more creepy stories, like and subscribe.